Oh,
Yes.
sorry, were you getting ready to?
No, you're good.
Can you clarify what you said last week about a man after God's own heart? Because I had grown up hearing it one way, recently heard it a different way. I think that you were refuting one of those, but I still struggle to understand.
Yes. So the two theories are: is it David has a heart like God's heart, or that in God's heart he decided to take on David? And I was refuting the second one. That it's not focused on necessarily on God's heart as much as it's focusing on David's heart, which is like God's heart.
Gotcha.
So that's more the emphasis on David's character rather than just God using a different euphemism to choose, right? Or a different, maybe euphemism is not the right word, a different phraseology for choosing David. That this was somebody he wanted as opposed to Saul. And that opens up a can of theological worms that the writer of Samuel's trying to open.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So is it wrong to say that David is the king of God's choosing? Is that inappropriate? Or?
Well, I would say that he's definitely God's choosing in a sense of he's the one that if God were to choose a king, it would have been David. But God does choose Saul, but he chooses Saul because Saul had a heart like the people's heart. So in some degrees, he chose both of them, but David was obviously the one that was the better one. And in some ways, although it's a what-if game that you can't really play, but I almost wonder if the Israelites had not rejected God as king, would God have given them David first? Yeah. And the fact that they rejected God as the warrior because they wanted a physical warrior, that God gave them Saul. So he chose to give them what they wanted, and then with David, he chose to give them what they needed. So Saul is definitely a man after his heart is like everybody else's heart, whereas David's heart is like God's heart, whereas Saul's is clearly not. So that would be the distinction I would make.
Cool.
So,
yeah.
And it is interesting because Samuel does refer to Saul as the king that the Israelites chose, but it's also clear that's the king that God chose, because God chose him twice before, or chose him before the second time that he's anointed king, and then the third time, and then God's already been at work.
Yeah,
and
you
the
Holy Spirit for a while.
Yeah.
So it's not inappropriate to draw some distinctions, and maybe even in accordance with God's. One of them lines up with God's commands, where his heart for the way that people should live.
Yeah.
But we don't want to say that either of them are outside of the Lord's sovereign choosing.
Right. Yep. So David, character-wise, has a heart after God's own heart. Saul, character-wise, has a heart after his own heart.
Yeah.
And so God's heart is the standard that they should aspire to.
Yeah.
But God chose both of them, but for completely different purposes.
Right. Yeah. What is that after preposition? It seems like a weird way to say it. I feel like that kind of confuses.
Yeah, that's
confuses things.
That is a good question. Yes, there you go. It's always next summer.
Yeah. Yeah, is it Greek this summer?
This summer is Greek, yep.
Planning on.
Yeah, I thought it was here at 15, but now I'm not seeing it. Just giving it to a neighbor who is better than you.
13, 14.
Oh, it's in chapter. Oh, yeah, here we go. And it says, yeah, it's actually, the Lord has sought for himself a man as his heart. So it's
Heart like his.
Yeah, so it's got it's got the letter K on the front, which is as, so comparison, as heart his, so as his heart. Yeah, the phrase shows up, actually, let me see, I know I have a paper that I downloaded just the other day. Let's see if I can find it here, where I put it. Let's see. Where would I put that? Theoretically, I would put it here. Probably not. We'll see. Maybe. Yeah, it's not here. I have a paper. This is it. Is this it? No, that's not it. I'll have to see if I can find it. It might be in my downloads folder on my computer, but I downloaded an article where he talks through, is it God's heart desiring David, or David's character like God's heart? And he goes through and compares a couple other instances where a similar phrase is used to describe people, and talks about how that shows that it's character, and that the character of David is primary in comparison with the character of God's heart. But I will see if I can track that down. I think it's on my computer, but I'll see if I can track it down. And I use Dropbox for everything, but my downloads folder is not in Dropbox. So that ends up making it a little more difficult when I forget to move it into its proper file on Dropbox. Well, I'm sure Sarah's still on her way, so let me go ahead and open this with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this evening, and again, the opportunity we have together and talk about Samuel and David. We pray, Lord, that you would bless our time tonight, that you would just give us wisdom and insight into the text, help us to know not only what is written in a historical sense, but help us also to understand in a theological sense, what is it that the writer of 2 Samuel is trying to tell us, and that we would learn from that, and that we would apply that. For it's in your name we pray. Amen. So, hi, Sarah. So, a number of things here in 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel is a fascinating book, and in terms of what it does not say. I was just reflecting upon it. So we've got 1 Samuel, and 1 Samuel deals in chapters 9 through about 11 and a half, maybe up through 12, with Saul. And then from chapter 12, really through the end of 1 Samuel, it's Saul going downhill and David going uphill. And so David is increasing, Saul is decreasing. We get to 2 Samuel, David becomes king, everything is great. We get about 11 chapters into the book, and then it's all downhill from there. So again, we've got both books that almost seem to be more interested in the downfall of the kings than they are necessarily in the rise of the kings. So we see David's life really focused on at the end of 1 Samuel, really the second half of 1 Samuel, starting with the slaughter of Goliath in chapter 17, all the way through the end of the book. He solidifies his kingdom in the first 3 or 4 chapters. Then in chapter 5 and chapter 6, he takes care of getting the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem and solidifying that part of the kingdom. 7 is the covenant with David, and then 8, 9, and 10 just kind of wraps up some odds and ends that seem to be really a response to the covenant. 11 is Bathsheba, and then it's all just downhill, revolt after revolt after revolt, all the way to the end. So the second half of the book is very negative. And if you really stop and think about it, there's really not that much even positive about David. We have him bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem and taking Jerusalem and then bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. That's historically important because Jerusalem becomes the capital. And yet, aside from that, we really only have about 3 chapters that are positive. Chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10. So we've got 3 chapters, about as much as we have of Saul, roughly. Chapters 11 and 12. And Saul's not really mentioned in 12, so chapter 11 of 1 Samuel. We got 3 really positive chapters on David. The rest of it is just kind of more details. How did we get David to be king? And then how do we go from David to Solomon? And then right in the middle is these 3 that are really focused on the reign of David. But other than that, there's not really much talked about, which is pretty fascinating when you think about it. That here you've got this man after God's own heart. He reigns for 40 years. And there's not a whole lot that we know about that 40 years, aside from the negative. We know that he attacks and kills the Ammonites, but we also know it's during one of those battles with the Ammonites that he's actually back with Bathsheba. We know that he has a covenant with Mephibosheth, which seems to be more important because of the fact that it's him extending a unmerited grace to Mephibosheth, much the same way that God extends unmerited grace to David. We've got David, there's one chapter that highlights his battles, but other than that, there's not a whole lot that he does positive. So it's not just, isn't David great? Actually, it almost seems to be the opposite. Now, don't you go thinking that David's a great guy. Even though it says he's a man after God's own heart. And occasionally you see it, but were it not for the book of Psalms, you don't know that we would see it at all. Aside from maybe his actions with Mephibosheth, we see him worshiping and bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, but even there's some problems because he gets somebody killed the first time, and not just a random guy. I mean, Uzzah is part of the priest's household, and he ends up getting killed because he's not doing it right. I mean, here's a man who says, I meditate on the law of God day and night. Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light into my path, and yet I skipped all the chapters on how to carry the Ark of the Covenant anywhere because those parts were boring. I mean, that's kind of the impression that I get as I read chapters 5 and 6 of Samuel, especially chapter 6 of 1 Samuel, of, come on, David, this isn't rocket science. You have the Ark of the Covenant, you know what the Ark of the Covenant is, and you know its history. You know what just happened with the Philistines with the Ark of the Covenant. You know what's happened with the Ark of the Covenant with the men of Beth Shemesh, how they looked into it. So this is not a box to take lightly. This is not just, hey, I'm going to, carry in the victory box here. This is a very serious piece of furniture. And it's supposed to be treated reverently because it's God's throne. And so you're just going to stick it on a cart, which you're not supposed to do. And he learns, it's almost like, oh, that didn't work. Hey, let's go read the law and see what the law says, how we're supposed to do this. So he learns, but he's already gotten somebody killed. So even that ends up being a negative. And to some degree, the focus of that chapter, especially his interaction with Michael, isn't so much about bringing in the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem as much as it is him making a complete fool of himself for the sake of honoring God. And these allusions to him acting very much like a priest, dancing in linen ephod, offering sacrifices. He's just so overjoyed that he's there sacrificing and bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. And I think in some ways demonstrating that this is not a political calculation. In the ancient Near East, after kings solidified their reign, or at least militarily solidified their reign, they would build a temple, because that's what you do. So you can go all the way back as many kings as you want throughout the ancient Near East, and they all do that. From Hammurabi to Ashurbanipal to any of those guys, they build temples. Some of them more than others. One of the reasons that that Nebuchadnezzar's son was such a failure as a king is he spent too much time building temples and not enough time actually ruling his country. And so Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar, was the one who was basically reigning in his place. And it was so terrible that the citizens of Babylon actually contacted the Persians and said, please invade us. We will open the door for you. And they literally did. They opened the gates when Cyrus got there, and he walked in and killed Belshazzar and took over. Because, I mean, that's how dysfunctional it was. So you can go too far overboard, but that was still a very common thing and especially if you felt that a rival god that was a rival of the god that your predecessor served, then you would especially build a temple to this new god or goddess that you were kind of thanking for bringing you to power. And yet David here breaks the mold, as does God. God will not let him build a house. And two, David pretty much demonstrates that this is not I'm going to solidify my reign by bringing the Ark of the Covenant in here, because he makes a complete fool of himself, which Michael is accurate in that, and yet it endears him to the people because it's so sincere. And Michael is annoyed because David's not acting how she thinks ancient Near Eastern kings should act. And on one hand, she's right. That's not how ancient Near Eastern kings act. And yet the writer of Samuel has made it very clear when they act the way they're supposed to act, like Saul, and they do the things that are normally done, leaving the king alive so that you can mock him when they go attack the Amalekites, saving the best of everything, using sacrifices to inspire the morale of the people, all these things that Saul did, that's what's normally done. And yet David here does the opposite. And yet he says, look, I'm going to be more undignified than this, and I will be glorified in their eyes. So there's no shame in this, says David. If anything, it's the opposite. You're mocking me and saying that I'm dishonoring myself, but actually I honored myself before the people because I demonstrated that my honor comes from God, not from what the people think of me. Which in 1 Samuel 15 is the opposite of what Saul said. Saul said, honor me before the people. I don't care about obeying. Right after Samuel had just said, so God hates you, he's going to take the kingdom from you. Oh, great. Hey, can you come back and honor me in front of the people? I mean, that's Saul's next response. And when my kids do that, when you're talking to them, and I can't believe you did this. I've told you so many times not to do this. Don't do this. And they look at you and they're like, oh. So can I go to a friend's house tomorrow? It's like, you haven't listened to a thing I've said. You have not been listening. Well, that's basically what Saul does. Samuel, you're done yet? Can we go back? Because I want to be honored in front of the people. Here's David saying, I don't care what the people think. And actually, because of the fact that I don't care what the people think, the people will actually think higher of me than if I tried to care what the people think of me. So there's an irony there in the story. And it turns out that Michael then is the one who is dishonored because she never has kids, and that's the end of the line of Saul in that regard.
That was pretty intense.
Yes.
She never had a child.
She never had a child, which is, yeah, that's very intense. So it's almost as though the writer of Samuel is trying to communicate to us that it's not so much what either king accomplished that gave them honor or could have given them honor, as much as it is that when they trusted in God and sought him with all their heart, then they had glory and honor. But when they didn't, it was a complete disaster. And it, especially with David, towards the second half of the book, is all on the dishonor that he has because of the dysfunction that he allows to create his family, because he doesn't trust in God. He goes and he takes honor for himself. One thing that the text does not say, but I think is logical to consider, why did David kill Uriah when he found out that Bathsheba was pregnant?
What?
Uh-huh.
Assumption is just so he could take her as his own wife and try to make it look like a natural
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
pregnancy. But that's what I would assume it is.
Mm-hmm.
Respect among his mighty men.
What's that?
I would say respect among his mighty men.
Mhm.
That's my guess.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely trying to cover it up and make it seem like Bathsheba is his and not Uriah's. I mean, he tries to cover it up first by having Uriah come home and sleep with her and then get her pregnant and then just claim that it's Uriah's. That doesn't work, so he hasn't killed. So now he can just take her as his wife. But who's he trying to cover it up from? You mentioned the mighty men, which I have to admit, you've only got 30 mighty men, and the other 29 are going to be thinking, we're expendable if our wives are hot. So make sure your wife doesn't bathe on the roof when I'm in battle because David's just going to take her. So on the one hand, yes, I think it is that.
Or just that they would be, you sent this guy up to the front lines because you wanted his wife. So
Mhm.
maybe you don't want our wives. What else do you want from us?
Right.
What do we have that you would possess that you're just going to screw us over for?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And you did it to him, so why should we follow you?
right.
But I don't know if that jives with the honor culture or not.
I think it
He's
does.
king and he can kind of do what he wants, and they
Well,
respect
yeah.
that, but
And that's what is somewhat surprises me is that it almost doesn't fit with honor culture.
no.
Because in an honor culture, he has the most honor, so he takes what he wants, and they can challenge him for it, maybe, but he's kind of their patron, so they kind of have to do whatever he says because they rely upon him. And yet he seems afraid of them. Both of the other 29 of the mighty men, but also the people in general. And so I think you're right, Jordan. I think he's trying to cover it up, and yet David's smart enough to know God knows all this. You know,
If God's the one he's trying to hide it from. There's no
Mhm.
point.
There isn't.
That's the only person he answers to.
Right. You're not really going to cover it up.
Yeah.
There's actually in that chapter there in chapter 11, you notice how many times the word sent shows up. Verse 1, David sent Joab. Verse 3, David sent and inquired of the woman. Verse 4, David sent messengers. Verse 5, the woman sends to David. Verse 6, David sent Joab. Let's see. Verse 18, Joab sent. Verse 22, again, Joab sent. And then beginning in chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord sent Nathan. So there's a lot of this sending that's happening, but the Lord is well aware of what's going on, especially as it says there at the end of chapter 11, the thing that David had done displeased the Lord, especially there in verse 22. David sent, again, and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. And this thing displeased the Lord. So at this point, since the baby's born, it's been at least 9 months since all this took place. So some time has passed. So I think to some degree, David thinks he's gotten away with it. And that was the motivation for killing Uriah, was to get away with it, not so much before God, as much as getting away with it before other people. But in order to do that, he had to, as Nathan says, he had to despise the Lord there in chapter 12, verse 9. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight?
And for a long period of time.
So he despised God. Again, there's that flip. of being more concerned about the honor of the people. He was concerned about what they would think about the fact that he had taken Bathsheba. Which even as in chapter 12, he says in verse 8, I gave you your master's house and your master's wives, the house of Israel and Judah, and I would have added to you much more. But you despised the word of the Lord. You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and have taken his wife to be your wife and have killed him. And then in verse 14, you have utterly scorned the Lord. The child who is born to you is about to die. The emphasis really in chapter 12, as much as he says you have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife, seems to be on Uriah. I mean, Bathsheba's name never shows up here. He never says you committed adultery with Bathsheba. It's led some people, some scholars, to suggest that Bathsheba went willingly, which is a cultural anachronism because whether she was willing or not is largely irrelevant in that culture. When the king sends for you, you do what the king says. So whether she was a willing partner or not, she didn't really have a choice. Yeah, it was very unwilling. You can ask the same question about Absalom later as he sleeps with all the concubines on the roof of the palace. Did they go willingly? I think it's largely irrelevant. Was he raping them, or was this a willing? It doesn't matter. You're a concubine. You do what you're told. There's no. But the fact that her violation here is never addressed. It's focused only on Uriah, which is again fairly fascinating. That it's not so much the adultery that's the problem, which it clearly is, but that fact that you took her, you killed Uriah, and you took her to be your wife. Which says to me that had David slept with Bathsheba and then repented, the outcome would have been a lot different. That in some ways it's almost as much the cover-up and the murder and the killing that's really the issue. Now, it's not to belittle the adultery. And it is hard to separate the adultery from the murder because it's all kind of wrapped together. And yet, to some degree, the adultery was kind of what started it rolling. David seems to have already pretty much decided, I'm taking her. She's going to be mine. So he made permanent what he really already decided. I'm taking her, I'm going to pretend she's my wife for the night. And then, okay, well, now I can't get Uriah to go along with this, so I'm just going to take her permanently. And all of Israel knows this. All Israel knows Uriah is dead. They don't necessarily know that that David is the father, per se. They don't really know that David has orchestrated all this. It all just seems like, oh, one of mighty men died, and David took the wife, and she got pregnant really quick. Doesn't seem that odd. But that's what David wanted them to think. But in order to do that, he had to despise the word of the Lord, because he had to murder Uriah, and then take Bathsheba as his wife. And that seems to be more what God is upset about. He's not upset about the adultery, but more upset about the taking. You went and you took something that wasn't yours. So everything you have, David, I've given you. Anything that you wanted, I've given you. And if you'd asked, I would have given you more. Almost implies, to some degree, David, if you were standing on the roof and you saw Bathsheba, and if you just simply said, hey, God, can I have some hot single woman maybe on that roof over there? I would have done it. So you didn't have to take the married one. There's a lot of rooftops. We could have found a single woman to bathe on a different rooftop, but nope, you had to go for the married one, and you took her. You didn't ask me. You orchestrated the events. you trusted me all along to give you the kingdom because I promised. You didn't take it from Saul when you had the chance twice to kill him. You've never taken things. You've always trusted me. Except this time. This time you took her. You didn't trust me to give her to you. You actually took her. And so the despising the word of the Lord, I think, is not just even despising the law of God, which is clearly part of it, but the word of the Lord of trusting that I would give you something. And especially in terms of us in our relationship with our spouses and our oftentimes desire for something else, I think there is that same aspect of it's yes, all of those sexual sins and anything that would enter into it is a violation of the law of God and a violation of the letter of the law of God. And yet the spirit of it is what God gave you was not good enough. So this woman that I'm married to, it's not good enough. I want that. So you're not satisfied with what I gave you, and you don't trust me that what I gave you is the best. So it's not even just you ignored me when I said you can only have one. You actually thought that having more than one wife or more than one husband would actually be a good thing. And so you had, at least in David's case, 3 wives or 4 wives, and you thought 5 would be better. But you didn't just do 5 wives, your 5th wife came from somebody else. So you didn't trust me to be able to find you a 5th wife. You had to go take her. And I think that's really at the heart of it, of this dissatisfaction and this lack of faith in the promises of God. That's the word to some degree that is despised. So that phrase word of God is almost playing a double purpose here. Word of God is in relation to the law, but even more so the word of promise of, look, David, chapter 7, I'm going to do all this great stuff for you. And yet David says, yeah, no, I'll just go find my own. Thanks for the offer, but I'll take care of it. I think that really seems to be at the heart of what's going on here. So that the punishment then is, yes, there's some sexual fallout of this. His daughter is raped. His concubines are all assaulted, all of that. But even more so, these revolts that happen are the sword in David's house, just as he used the sword of the Ammonites to kill Uriah. That seems to be more the natural connection between the two, rather than just the adultery and Tamar. But Tamar, I mean, that whole scenario is horrific, but really that's what starts the animosity between Amnon and Absalom, so that Absalom kills Amnon, which probably David should have done, but there's still a sword there. And then Absalom ends up getting killed, and then Adonijah ends up getting killed by Solomon. And I mean, it's just death after death after death of sons murdering each other and killing each other. And it strikes us as sad. What's fascinating is I don't know how many people in the ancient Near East would have thought, unless you were from the house of Israel, I don't know how many of them would have read the end of 2 Samuel as a tragedy. Because in the ancient Near East, kings would deliberately pit their sons against one another in the effort to see who was the strongest. Because the last man standing became king. And so you would deliberately instigate fights between them. And so here, there's something substantially different in the way that Israel obviously has their succession take place. That it's not just based on survival of the fittest and whoever can kill everybody else, but that the end of 2 Samuel is a tragedy in David's house, even if culturally it probably looked the same as every other ancient Near Eastern house at the time. You're seeing what you would have seen elsewhere, but in Israel it's the direct consequence of David's sin. So it ends up being just all all downhill. But again, I think it's emphasizing that point that has already been made of this is what happens when you choose to honor people or honor yourself before people rather than choosing the honor that only God gives. So you're taking honor rather than trusting God to give you honor, which is really part of what Saul did not understand, and David did understand, because occasionally he does that. He trusts in God to exalt him. He trusts in God to give him honor and glory for doing the right thing, and yet here we see David kind of fall into that same trap as Saul, where he's taking rather than trusting God to give. So if in some ways the writer of Samuel has chosen to emphasize that by telling us all the negative, rather than saying, see, here's one guy, Saul, who screwed it up and everything worked out great. He's kind of shown us, okay, here's David who did everything right and it worked out wonderfully, except when it didn't, because then even David forgot. So he's not holding up Saul on one hand and David on the other hand. He's holding up Saul and David and David. The David who is different from Saul and the David who is like Saul. And it's it ends up being a tragedy, but it's a tragedy that David created for himself, which is sad because he created it for himself by doing something he had already, he violated a lesson he'd already learned and had, I don't know, well, he didn't forget. He certainly chooses to turn his back on trusting God to honor him, which is sad because then it's all downhill from there. Sarah, you look like you have a thought.
In the lecture, you had mentioned something like that weird chapter where the sometimes supposed to be considered cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But we have God conditioned child who says God.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have God conditioned sheep.
Uh-huh.
Because I don't know how as a mom you would be able to get through that and think, Lord, you let this man rape me, you let this man kill my husband, and now you're putting his son.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to take the kingdom from me.
Right.
But you took my child.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we not look at that situation and question God in some instance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
Sorry, bring some more risk.
No, that's okay. It is a very difficult question of why does God kill the child? I took a Christian education class when I was in seminary, and the professor was trying to demonstrate that as a class you just vote on the answer, which is ridiculous. So we all came up with theories and then we voted on them. And I remember thinking, this is the dumbest form of Hebrew exegesis you could possibly have. Let's just vote on the answer. And why he chose this controversial passage, I don't know, but that's the one he chose. So, but one of the options that was put out there was that, well, God killed the child for David's sin. And I pointed out that same verse of, well, that's against the law, you can't do that. And yet, on the other hand, the child dying is, I would say, a consequence of David sinning. I almost wonder, although it's never brought up in 2 Samuel, it's never even brought up in the New Testament. But the fact that you have a son of David dying for David in some roundabout fashion. You know, a lot of scholars they just find the imagery pretty cool and point ahead to Christ. And that's certainly true on the one hand. Part of me almost wonders if it serves a practical purpose in a weird, twisted sort of way. God knows that the next king of Israel is going to be Solomon. Mm-hmm. It's going to be the son of Bathsheba. And Solomon's paternity is not in doubt. But this child's would have been. And so on the one hand, it's convenient that the child dies, but on the other hand, you're right. I mean, you see David's pain. You never see Bathsheba's pain, but you know it's there. You know that she loses a child over this. So you killed me, or you killed my husband in order to have this child with me, and then I lose that child too.
The fact that she had a second child with
Yes.
after that.
Yeah.
I mean, but if we say that the child is a result of David's sin, the people who try to say that in the past,
Mm-hmm.
does the Lord still work in that way with our children now? That's a sticky question. I don't really
It
know if I
is.
want the answer to.
The way that I get around it, if you want to say that, is to say that it is a consequence of David's sin, not a punishment of his sin. Which only makes us feel better in a legal sense. It doesn't help with the emotional side of it. Because the child is still dying because his parents did something, or because David did something. Basically, David, you took a wife that was not yours, and you had a child by her, and it's not a punishment, but it's just you can't have that child. He wasn't yours to have. You took him. Yes, I know it's your child, but you can't have him, and that's just a consequence of your decision. So it's not a punishment per se, as much as it is just a consequence of what David did, which again is it's very hard for us to wrap our minds around, and it doesn't really help the pain any. And in some ways, the text is silent. There's a book I've been reading. There's two of them. One is I think it's called a Feminist Companion to, I think it's Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. It's actually pretty good. I've actually really enjoyed it. And probably the one pushback I would have to it is that they infer a lot. And not even so much because they have an agenda, because the feminist scholars who write in it are actually very good scholars. Carol Meyer is one of the authors. She's a very good scholar. Joyce Baldwin writes in it. She's a very good scholar. So you've got these scholars who are very scholarly, are brilliant women. So they probably go farther than they should in some of their theories, but not to the point of it's not the stereotypical, it's not, lesbian readings of the Book of Job or something completely off the wall like that. It's actually very good. In fact, I was teasing somebody the other day. They were commenting on how they really liked the sermon that I preached on 1 Samuel chapter 1 and the perspective on Hannah. He's like, where'd you get that? I said, the Feminist Companion to 1st and 2nd Samuel. I said, but it's a fabulous article. It's so well written. But they do a really good job of kind of pulling out some of the things that the text doesn't say, in showing that in a male-dominated Israelite culture just wasn't important. But it's sad when you realize that, yeah, David was, he had a devastated wife on his hands. It doesn't seem that Bathsheba had any other children. At least they're not mentioned. So this is her first child that she loses. So, I mean, just the devastation of that. I mean, it's horrific. And it is a shame that it's not talked about. There are two of them. There's, I think, the Feminist Campaign in the Hebrew Bible, and there's a couple I each of the names for them. But they're very good because they go through and they talk about some of those aspects that we just don't think about. It's hard to know, biblically speaking, because it's not in the text. But just from a human standpoint, of Bathsheba had to be devastated to lose her child in that way. As even more devastated than David, as devastated as he is. So it is a horrific set of circumstances. And yet, this is one of the other things that's fascinating about 2 Samuel, and more so second than first, is that there's a number of circumstances in 2 Samuel that work out very conveniently for David. So you've got the whole situation with Michael. What happens if Michael and David had a child? Yeah, all of a sudden it's like, okay, the Benjaminites want to take that son and say, well, that's the descendant of the heir of Michael, therefore the descendant of the line of Saul, therefore he should be king, and not David passing it on to Solomon. So it's very convenient that Michael never has any other children. The same thing here with this whole son, there's no questions about paternity. And then when you mentioned the part about the descendants of Rechab, I think that's her name, the concubine of, all of a sudden, we're killing off any remaining sons of Saul, which again is very convenient. We took care of them. We got rid of all those extra sons, so now there are no descendants of Saul left except for the line of Mephibosheth. They're all dead. They've all been killed. To the fact that they had to go and take the descendants of a concubine in order to find sufficient sons to go off here. I'm sorry, Rizpah, not Rechab. Rizpah is the daughter. So in fact, Rizpah is the concubine that Abner had slept with, that got Ishbosheth so upset back in chapter 2. So she has these sons with Saul, and then they're all put to death on behalf of the Gibeonites. And you're left with the same scenario there of, well, wait a minute, why are we killing these sons for something Saul did? It seems very twisted, very almost pagan in some ways. That we're going to kill off the sons because their dad killed somebody else's sons. It makes us feel uncomfortable. Almost to the point that David kind of seems like he's manipulating circumstances here for his own benefit. They do say, at least the way the text reads, it's the Gibeonites who asked David, hey, David, can we have the sons of, verse 5 and 6, let 7 of his sons be given to us, that we may hang them before the Lord at Gibeah, the chosen of the Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord. And the king said, I will give them. So just to put this into perspective, he takes the 2 sons of Rizpah. He takes 5 sons of Merab, although there is a textual variant that says Michael, but we know she didn't have kids. This is Merab, the first wife that David was supposed to have, and she was given to somebody else. He takes the 5 sons, but that means that he's basically handing over his nephews to be put to death. So yeah, it's a political rival, but these are his wife's sister's sons. So I don't know how many of you have nephews, but imagine being like, yep, well, it's a great family reunion we had last year. Yeah, I really enjoyed playing football with you. But I have to kill you, sorry. It's a very odd turn of circumstances.
Well, it's weird because the Lord seems to.
Yes.
To know.
Yeah, because he stops the. God responded to the plea for the land there in verse 14.
In the beginning, David's like, Lord, why is this happening?
Mm-hmm.
It's all dead, yeah.
I don't know, I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking it's like in God's legal sense.
Mm-hmm.
The child and Saul's sons and hold it enough to deserve his wrath.
Sure.
So could he be using his just wrath upon them to illustrate a story of his providence, possibly?
It's possible. It's one of those frustrating things because we don't always definitively know why it happened. We didn't really have anything unusual, I guess, in 1 Samuel. I mean, the most unusual textual thing we have in 1 Samuel is the fact that Saul can't remember who David is or who Jesse is. So whose boy is that? That's David. Oh, have I met him? Yeah, he plays harp for you. Oh, who's his dad? Jesse, the guy that you just said to, hey, I love your son David. That guy. Oh, that Jesse. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's just, that's an odd story combination there. But there's a way that you can put those two together. Nobody died in 1 Samuel because you couldn't remember who David was. But here, it's just, you're kind of left with a, to the point that Bruce Halpern, who's a very liberal scholar, thinks that basically they whitewashed all the stories and that actually Solomon is the illegitimate child of David and Bathsheba, and that this story didn't actually take place, but that Solomon commissioned 2 Samuel to be written to explain, here is why I'm allowed to kill Joab. Here's why I am not the illegitimate son of David and Bathsheba. Here's why Uriah is not my father. David is definitely my father. Here's why all the sons of Saul have been killed off. Here's why my dad had no kids with Michal. And I disagree with Bruce's take on it, but as you read it, you're like, yeah, I get where he gets that. He also thinks that that David actually murdered Saul, and then blamed it on the Philistines and the Amalekites. And obviously, the writer of 1 Samuel puts David in a completely different place. And Bruce Halpern says, yeah, that's a likely alibi. I wasn't there. I was off chasing, the descendants of the Amalekites, and the Egyptians across the plains trying to get my people back. And I just conveniently got all the plunder and nobody died, except for the enemies. And Bruce says, yeah, that's too convenient. But again, you're left with, yeah, it is very convenient, and not a whole lot of explanation in the text. I mean, this is the last story of David's life. Because the next story is him singing this song and rejoicing about the fact that he has been delivered from Saul, and then the whole scenario with the counting of the people. But it's an odd way to end the book. And you're kind of left with a recognition of this is not really just history. This is doesn't read like the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, so this guy was born, he killed a bunch of people, and he died. And if there was anything significant that he did, we'll tell you about it. So he did this, and then he did this, and then he did this, and he did this, and he did this, and he did this, and that's the order he did them, and then he died. Boom, done, end of story. Instead, you've got, so here's this guy. He was a man after God's own heart, except when he was killing people and raping people and pillaging people and leading 70,000 of his own countrymen to their deaths, and except when he was doing this and that and that. But the rest of the time, he was great. I can't think of those times, so I'm only going to tell you about 2 chapters worth. But other than that, he was a great guy. And you're left with, this is just twisted. What kind of book are we writing here? So in 1 Samuel, if we stopped after 1 Samuel, it makes complete sense. You've got what seems like a continuation of the time of the Judges, and then you've got the time of the Judges is over. We are now moving on to kings who ruled in the name of God. No, actually, this is still the Judges. We've just got kings now instead of judges who are doing their own thing. But there's this man coming, David, and he is going to be great. He's a man after God's own heart. We get to the end, yep, David's going to be king. And then it doesn't go anywhere near as swimmingly as we hoped. It's 2 Samuel is almost a letdown as you read it.
You think David followed the instructions of Uriah to write down a copy of the law?
I think so.
Because he mentions that the law, he meditates on the law day and night, but he very usefully disregards it.
Uh-huh.
Most of his problems stem from just that one verse.
Yeah, because it's not even like David isn't repentant after that.
Right.
When David confronts him, it's like you said. I think that's really the big difference between him and Saul. Saul's never repentant. David
Right.
often is. But yeah, he really does. I don't know, just kind of that one point of you're despising. Like you were not believing, not trusting. It's just, yeah, it all goes away quickly. But maybe, you know, it's very deliberate to say there is no human savior.
Yeah.
The
It's
best
just
you have to offer is not.
it's just fascinating that the both 1st and 2nd Samuel seem to be written to set up expectations that this is going to be great, only to dash them.
Yeah.
You think the time of the judges is going to continue? Nope. We've got Samuel. Oh, great. And then now we're going to have a king. Oh, this will be good. No, it's not.
Is that
You
on
know,
purpose?
I think so. In 1 Samuel, I think it is. And in 2 Samuel, I think it is. But it's fascinating that he keeps setting you up for, here's what you expect. Nope, this is what happens. So you expect something bad? Nope, this is going to be great. We got Samuel. Oh, well, we'll have Samuel. We'll just make a dynasty out of him. Nope, his sons are worthless. Oh, well, we'll have a king. That'll be great. Nope, it's going to be terrible. Oh, well, we have David. Nope, he's terrible too. You know, it's always...
The same thing with the judges. They set it up with Joshua
Yeah,
conquering
Joshua's
the land and Othniel, and it goes to be great. You have Samson. And honestly, I can like Samson better than I can like David.
Yes,
Samson
Yeah.
seems like a peach compared to David.
he does. He does.
At
And
least he does something with the job.
He does.
That's it.
and with Samson, there's a part at which, if it weren't for the writer of Hebrews saying he's a man of great faith, which we don't see all of the book of Judges, we're left thinking, yeah, he's probably not a Christian. He's probably not in heaven. He was pretty worthless. And then you read in Hebrews, and you're like, oh well, maybe I was wrong. Maybe he is a man of great faith, and I just don't see it. There's hope for us all. But then with David, you're like, this is a man after God's own heart? How? Now, in David's defense, keep in mind we're covering 40 years of history in 2 Samuel. So in 1 Samuel, we've covered somewhere, I would estimate somewhere around, I don't know, I think I said 17 to 18 years-ish. David and his 3 younger brothers are not at the battle, which suggests that they're younger than 20. Assuming there was no twins, David, the oldest, is 16 or 17. We'll say he's 15 just for fun. He becomes king at 30. So 15 years, he wasn't king. So we cover 15 years from chapter 17 to the end of 1 Samuel. We cover 40 years from the beginning of 2 Samuel to the end of the book. And yet the writer of 2 Samuel has deliberately picked all the bad things, which he didn't have to, because the writer of Chronicles picks all the good things. There are no bad things about David in Chronicles. It's only the good things. And yet here you have this emphasis upon David's a dirtbag here. David's a dirtbag here, and he's the idiot here, and he's a, you've just got time after time after time. And there are a number of possible reasons. Perhaps he's writing the book, again, during the reign of Solomon, that he's almost writing the book as a piece of wisdom literature. Which is a interesting thought. I'm gonna have to think about that one some more. But that's an interesting thought that he's writing it as a piece of telling the other kings all the way from the beginning of the book with Hannah
instructing kings, look, this is, lead in humility. God's is your strength, not by might. Almost quoting from Zechariah, not by might or power, but by my spirit. All the way through both 1st and 2nd Samuel of, look, this is when the kings screw up. So all of you other kings, listen to what I'm saying. Because there's nothing about idolatry aside from the divination reference. There's very little about idolatry, which really is the problem in 1st and 2nd Kings. The problem is idolatry. Even with the kings of Judah, the number of times that the high places are not removed is mentioned in almost every king. It almost becomes sort of the litany that we see in the book of Judges, where there's a form, and various parts of the form are there. They served this many years, and this king came, and then this happened, and then he was judged for this many years. Kind of that judge motif. Well, there's also a king, a regnal form that does the same thing in Kings. In the northern kingdom, it's they follow the sins of Jeroboam. In the southern kingdom, it's they don't take care of the high places. Neither of which show up here in 2 Samuel. So it's almost as though it's written as before the fall of Solomon into idolatry, basically saying, or perhaps even written in David's lifetime, because he's not dead at the end of the book, but basically saying, okay, here's all the ways that I screwed up. Learn from my mistakes. Don't take matters into your own hands. Trust God to work it out. I could have killed off all the sons of Saul. I could have just killed them all off whenever I felt like it. But I didn't, because I didn't think that was right. Instead, a group of Gibeonites walked in and said, hey, can we have all the remaining sons of Saul? God took care of it for me. You got to trust God. Trust God to murder all your enemies. It'd be great. Maybe that's the impact that he's trying to say is, okay, here is this, here is this book written to encourage a specific set of kingly behaviors in Israel, which would fit with what's missing in the book, and it would fit with what's there in the book. I'm not going to tell you all the great things that David did unless it's emphasizing the fact that he trusted God and look, these things happened. But I don't need to go into all these great details because my goal in writing 2 Samuel is not to make David look good. So this is not a flowery court history and David did this, and then he did this, and then he did this. Isn't David wonderful? Instead, and then David did this, and then he was a royal screw-up. And then he did this, and then he was a royal screw-up. And then he did this, and dude, he's just a complete idiot. Don't be like David. But be like David and trust God. So which might explain some of the back and forth that takes place in the book, that it is almost like, it's almost like reading Ecclesiastes in some ways. I tried this and that failed, and I tried this and that failed, and then I got to the end of my life and realized, well, that was dumb. So here I wrote this book for you so that you'll know, don't do this. Instead, here's the conclusion of the matter. Serve God. Love him only. There, boom. I've been there, learned from my mistakes. So I almost wonder if the writer of Samuel is writing it from that perspective of, I'm not writing a history like Kings or even like Chronicles. I'm not even really writing a history. I'm using historical events to show you this is what happens when you don't trust God. And he deals with all of the major pitfalls that we see from Deuteronomy 17. Don't stockpile women. Well, I see that more with Solomon. But here's David. A woman is his downfall. Don't stockpile armies. End of the book. Armies are his downfall. Don't collect lots of horses. At least that one's not mentioned. So maybe David didn't have lots of horses. So he's got one good thing going for him. Didn't have lots of horses. But perhaps David is presenting, or is being presented as almost the foil of Deuteronomy 17. When David did not do, or when David did what he was supposed to do, it was great. When David went after these other things that he was told not to go after, even back to your question of, did he write a copy of the law of God for himself? He did eventually, but at what point?
I mean, we don't know everything because Second Samuel is a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like he gets, both him and Solomon get worse as they get older.
Yes.
And that's not necessarily the trajectory that we would expect in, a new covenant sanctification.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard for me to wrestle with that.
Yep.
He's a man after God's own heart. He seems to be getting more and more gifts,
Mm-hmm.
the more wisdom he should have.
Right.
I wonder if both of them kind of follow the same pattern. I mean, there's a lot of debate about Solomon, I know.
Yes.
And like when he wrote certain books and all that.
Right.
Like if he wrote them when he was still doing good, or I tend to think he wrote at least Ecclesiastes towards the end of his life.
Yeah,
That's
yes.
what it seems like. So it seems like they both follow this pattern of like starting off really well, going through a lot of crap in the middle, and then learning from that and coming to greater righteousness. And like, I don't know. I think they're fascinating for that reason, but I think for all of us, Paul David might be my favorite character of the Old Testament, I think.
Yeah.
Because I think in important ways, like he is great. And like understanding that is like it's difficult.
Right.
It's hard, but I mean he receives more praise than almost every other character in scripture. And he receives praise from God.
Yes.
Who like is so holy even the angels cannot attain to his greatness.
Right.
And God praises him. And I think, I mean, you come to those tricky passages in the Psalms where David talks about how righteous he is. And like you have to take that seriously. Yeah.
I never knew that at the end of this.
Yeah. I mean, but and then like you know that like God also wrote that.
Right.
Like God inspired that. You have
Yes.
to take that seriously.
Absolutely.
David is righteous.
It's one of those fascinating things about the doctrine of the inspiration and inerrancy of Scripture that you lose if you don't hold to that you lose when you read the historical books. Because we have a book that praises David and makes him look like the greatest saint ever, and that's Chronicles. And to some degree, Chronicles does the same with Solomon. Makes him look pretty good. Even makes Manasseh look good by the end of his life, which is that's a feat in itself. So you've got this book that I wouldn't say whitewashes it, but it's writing from a particular viewpoint and a particular goal, and so it makes all the house of David look great. But then you've got this other book that's just very realistic and tells you all the dirt on David, which makes sense if the writer of Samuel did not necessarily know the writer of Chronicles was going to write, but God did. And so, here we have this book that doesn't feel the need to make David look like a saint. And yet God continues to praise him. And we see David's heart, aside from all the garbage going on, because we have the Psalms. Sarah, you keep looking at the numbers that I have on the board up there. These are the 13 Psalms that have a superscription, or it might not be the right word, subscription, I suppose. It's part of the title. In our English Bibles, we have the title, Psalm 73, and then it'll say underneath, usually in italics, Psalm of David, blah, 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 verse 1, and then the psalm starts. In Hebrew, that title is verse 1. So that all of our verses in our Hebrew Bibles in any psalm that has a title are one off. So sometimes when you're reading a commentary, it'll have in parentheses like HB1, even though you're in verse 2. So they are including both of those. So in these 13 psalms, we have a superscription or a subscription, depending on if you want to talk about it as being a subscript of a Psalm of David, or if it's a superscription in the sense that it's a title and it's all part of the title. You can use whatever term you want. I use them somewhat interchangeably, even though they're technically the opposites of each other. But so you got these titles that really have nothing to do with the psalm that they're in. So it is somewhat common, very common. In fact, I would say the majority of scholars today would say that you should dismiss them and ignore them. Nobody can give a reason why. They give insinuations as to why. Oh, it has nothing to do with the psalm. Psalm 51, after David sinned with Bathsheba, and yet he never mentions anything about Bathsheba in the psalm and never even indicates what sin that he sinned. So clearly that's not really connected to the sin of Bathsheba. Well, that's a kind of a circular argument. There's no way to prove or disprove it. So I personally, I wrote a paper on this that there, I think, is more evidence to suggest that these are original than to suggest that they're not. And the fact that there are only 13 of them, I think, adds to that. Psalm 30, I have an asterisk because that one doesn't give a historical situation. It says for the dedication of the house, and it doesn't really specify what house. It's probably the temple. And David theoretically wrote it for the dedication of the temple. So that was not really a historical circumstance, but the rest of them are historical circumstances where they actually say, David wrote this in a particular time. If it weren't for those, though, we would almost get the impression that David wrote every psalm at the end of his life after he'd gotten his act together. And I kind of like that we have the titles because it shows us that David wasn't a complete idiot his whole life and then only got it at the end. But that it was more ups and downs throughout his life. And even when he sins with Bathsheba, as horrific as that is, we get such a beautiful psalm like Psalm 51. Although we still have him saying, against you and you only have I sinned. And we're like, what about Bathsheba? What do you mean you only? You killed Uriah. Uriah's like, nothing to worry about it. You only sinned against God, it wasn't me. No, you sinned against Uriah, you killed the guy. So you didn't just sin against God. So even there, we kind of get a little annoyed in the circumstances of it. But yeah.
What about these other ones that say the Psalm of David? What's the distinguishing?
The difficult part in Hebrew is that the word to, like to David, is the same word as of David, by David, for David, sounds like David, might have something to do with David. I met David once. All of those are the same preposition, so that some psalms, as you read them, sound more like a dedication to David. Other ones sound like by David. So, yeah. So I almost end up more just saying they're all Davidic in one sense or another. Here, though, so I mean, you could make the same argument. This is for David when he fled from Absalom, his son. But it makes more sense, at least, I think, to say that no, David wrote it when he was fleeing from Absalom. And especially with Psalm 3, it does not surprise me that it's more general. Because a lot of these, as David is writing them, he knows he's writing them for posterity's sake. This is not David being poetic for the sake of being poetic. In a lot of them, he knows he's writing worship songs. And so it's almost as though he's writing a depersonalized psalm in the midst of personal experiences so that anybody can use this in the worship of God. And David seemed to know that. So I think if I could give a good example, it would be when you listen to Christian radio. A lot of those songs, in fact, the vast majority of those songs would not be appropriate in a worship context. Musicality aside, just the words are just not written for a generalized audience to be worshiping God together. It's personal feelings. I'm writing a personal song that I'm going to sing personally because I have feelings. Yeah. Yes. Even what's that? There's that song that Justin Bieber sings about. Yes. Yeah. There you go. He has one. The chorus is, "My mom doesn't even like you, and she likes everyone." So if you want to love yourself,
That's what it is.
yeah. And he didn't write it. Somebody else wrote it, but when he sang it, he basically put himself in it And when you ask him, he will say that there was a scenario in his mind that he had in mind as he was singing it. But you have to have broken up with someone in order to actually sing that song. And they had to be a complete selfish person in order for the song to make any sense. And you had to have a mother that completely hated them, or the song doesn't make sense. There's a lot of details to fit that not Justin Bieber has a crazy enough life that it doesn't surprise me he could come up with a scenario, but he didn't write it. Somebody else wrote it. And there's a couple of songs like that not everybody can sing it. The same as the other one by Maroon 5, Memories. They didn't write that one. Somebody else wrote it. But they sang it, and they talk about having a personal experience that's similar. Most of us couldn't sing that one either because we don't have those sort of personal experiences. But hymn writers, on the other hand, when they wrote hymns, it is well with my soul. There is nothing in that hymn that suggests that he is standing looking at the site in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean where all of his kids died. Because he's standing, as he's writing that hymn, he is sitting on a boat in the exact spot where the ship sank, where all of his daughters died. So when sorrows like sea billows roll, that's about the only connection with water in the hymn. And if you didn't know the story, it's just, it's great poetry. But he has a personal experience there. And he knows what he's talking about when he says sea billows roll, because he's standing there watching them roll as he's contemplating the fact that all of his kids died in that spot. Phillip P Bliss, who was the songwriter for D.L. Moody for a long time, has some great songs. And if you know some of the stories, then you know some of the stories that he's incorporated into his music. But again, very, very general, because they were writing it for a worship context and they knew that. So they were hymn writers. So they didn't write the songs to be specific because they wanted everybody to be able to sing them. So we all sing It Is Well With My Soul, and yet I have never once, as I'm singing that song, thought to myself, I lost my daughters in a shipwreck. I've never thought that. I'm thinking of other circumstances that I'm saying is well with my soul, which is how Horatio Spafford, I think is his name, that's how he intended it to be written, or to be sung, is that everybody thinks of their circumstances. So not the specifics, but the general. And I think David is doing the same thing here. He's showing us generally, this is how you sing and worship in these specific circumstances. So it doesn't surprise me that there's not a direct connection between the circumstance and the psalm. But yet there's also enough of one that he includes this as this is when I wrote this. I wrote this when, or the choir master puts this in. This is when David wrote this in this circumstance of his life. So in that sense, we're able to see David's heart in the midst of some of these horrific circumstances. Even especially there in chapter 3, which I think in Psalm 3, break the teeth of the wicked. Well, then Absalom's killed. He just goes to pieces. And it's like, David, you prayed for this. This is what you prayed for. And David's like, yeah, and I didn't mean that. Just the teeth. I didn't mean kill the kid. I meant just break his teeth. So even there, the general versus the specific, I think, comes through in the Psalms. But you do see his heart. So if it weren't for Psalms and if it weren't for Chronicles and all we had was Samuel, and you're reading Man After God's Own Heart, you'd be, what? This doesn't seem like a man after God's own heart. But when you put Chronicles together with Psalms together with Samuel, you're like, okay, I see it. And I think that's the wonder of inspiration and inerrancy and the what's the word I'm looking for? The sovereignty, that's not the word I'm looking for, superimposing, I guess, of God, of his will upon the text, of this is how it's written so that these pieces go together. So that to some degree, even with Solomon, you see, yeah, he had a completely, he crashed and burned at the end, and yet you've got Ecclesiastes, and you're like, yeah, maybe pull it back together. There's hope. And you read Proverbs, and you're like, okay, I think he figured it out. It gives a fuller picture which sometimes we lose because of the way that we study books, even in seminaries, of when we talk about wisdom literature, we don't cover 1st and 2nd Samuel. We cover poetry. When we talk about the law, we don't talk about 1st and 2nd Kings. We talk about 5 books of Moses. When we talk about the prophets, we don't talk about Nathan. We talk about the 12 minor prophets and the several major prophets. So we end up compartmentalizing, but I don't think that Scripture is really supposed to be read that way to a large degree. Recognizing, no, we get a fuller sense of who they are alongside it, so that the writer of Samuel, whether he himself knew of the existence of Psalms, but felt that it was appropriate to write a book basically bashing David. Which makes me think, especially if David or Solomon is behind the book in the sense that they either commissioned it or wrote it themselves. Very honest. This is what happened. This is how I screwed up. And you need to learn from me. Which then gives us a different sense of, okay, we keep saying that this class is historical books, and yet we read Judges, which is historical, but not in a historically linear order. It's definitely set up as a theological treatise using historical information. 1st Samuel, we're like, okay, we're on to some actual history here, because so far we're going in order, sort of. And then we get to 2nd Samuel, and then we're like, now we're back to, I'm going to put this in whatever order makes the best theological case. You know, the book ends with David screwing up. I think it's 70,000 people. Isn't that the number?
Yeah.
70,000 people. I mean, I would have to go through and count it up, but it sounds very similar to what we talked about with Jephthah of, you've just got more Israelites killed than all of the ancient enemies of Israel put together.
Well, and he had just numbered them. And it was only like 800,000 in the whole thing. So, I mean, that's a pretty rough percentage.
And now we're going to kill 10%.
And it makes all of the Israelites, as you get closer to the New Testament, definitely during Jesus' time, when they're thrusting in people like Moses and David and some of the other guys are the best things ever. Can't say anything bad about them. The Old Testament says lots of things bad about them. You guys are putting your trust in these guys.
Yep.
But the other thing that struck me, which is sort of unrelated, is that when God created Eve, he called her very good. She was one of his best creations, and he gave her as a gift to Adam. And I don't know exactly, I mean, I'm a woman, I don't know the appeal of women to the rest of mankind, but it sure has screwed them up. Because the entirety of the Old Testament is stick to one wife, keep it in your pants, hold the account. Your sons would be killing each other if you didn't have 6 different concubines all warring for the throne. Or this guy's and this guy's inheritance, and his father's in question because you slept with this one. And we don't get it. They just don't. They just do the same thing over and over and over again.
So much of it makes me go back to. In fact, I just wrote an article that Roland is proofing for me on the
Back in 6 months.
a theology of sexuality. Of realizing that sexuality is tied to the covenant. It is a covenant sign of covenant oneness. So here you've got a covenant with David in chapter 7. You've got a covenant with Mephibosheth in chapter 8, and then you got David violating a covenant in chapter 11, which I don't think is coincidence. I think it's and it because of that, it challenges the covenant with God. Because then you're left with, okay, you got the covenant with God, excellent. You got the covenant with Mephibosheth, all systems go. Then you got the breaking of the covenant with Bathsheba, and you begin to wonder, wait a minute, is this gonna like make null and void the covenant with, I just picking off the top of my head here, I'd have to go look it up, but Bathsheba is the daughter of an oath, would be her name, which is very ironic. That for the rest of the book, the oath, the swearing, the covenant of God is going to be tested. Is he going to remain faithful to his covenant? And the obvious answer is yes. And to some degree, I think it's even why the book ends the way that it does. You got David rejoicing in chapter 22 with the covenant. I think I have the chapter right there, 22 or 23. Rejoicing in, this is what God has done for me. He's preserved his covenant. This is great. And then you've got David violating the covenant, this time as king with the people, getting them all killed. And yet there's still an emphasis upon covenant because now this is where the temple's going to be built. And so it's setting the stage for kings of, we are going to build the temple on this site. But again, the temple is part of that covenant. It's part of the covenant back with Moses. And so you still have this emphasis upon covenant. A covenant has been broken repeatedly, and yet it keeps coming back to the covenant of God, not the covenant that David made and broke, but the covenant that God made with David. Yes, you violated my covenant, but I don't violate my covenant. I'm going to keep my covenant. Yes, you did not count the people the way that you're supposed to. And yes, to some degree, David is demonstrating a lack of faith here because he's trying to trust in the amount of men that he has. He's building an empire, as it were. I need to know how many men I have so I can go invade other people. And yet there are provisions made in the Old Testament for counting people, which goes back to Sarah's point. Did he read the law or just skim it? There is a provision made where you give the half shekel temple tax to as blood money, basically. But as somebody pointed out, that money is referred to as atonement money. The only time that atonement is not tied to a sacrifice, and yet it's still tied to sacrifice because it's tied to temple. And yet here's David not doing the temple tax, but by not doing the temple tax, it results in the temple. And it's a very ironic twist at the end of the book of here's David not wanting to rely upon God, but wanting to rely upon his armies. And the result is that David and every Jew after him will have to be dependent upon the temple and the sacrifice at the temple for the sin that they've just committed. And so here's this act of independence that results in the greatest demonstration of dependence in the Old Testament, the dependence upon the temple and the sacrifice. So there's this constant ironic twist of violation of the covenant and yet God being faithful to his covenant. And I think some of that even goes back to the question of Eve. God gave Eve to Adam, and Adam says, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone. Therefore, a husband will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And it's this great covenant. And yet, what does Adam do? He violates the covenant.
David, it says that he despised the word of the Lord. Well, he also despised the Lord's good gift.
He did
the same thing. Adam despised Eve.
Yep.
Well, this is this great gift that you gave to me, Gadish. And David uses the same gift in horrible, idolatrous ways. And I've always wondered, why did God get so mad? Why did he react so violently against this one situation? Because basically, he had adultery with one woman and he killed one man. But in the spectrum of these
yes,
two people.
Right.
I mean, why did you freak out over that? Because you slayed 10,000 men and you get off of it with sacrifice. But it's despising. It's despising the Lord and his good gift.
Exactly. Yep. God, everything you've given me is not good enough. So it's not just a I want to see how many men I have because I want to go kill somebody. And oops, I forgot to pay the half shekel. Yeah. Even though Joab of all people is the one who keeps reminding me, don't do this. If Joab gets it, that should be a major red flag because Joab doesn't get anything. But Joab even gets it. In fact, just to spite him, he doesn't even counter. I'll show you. I'm not going down there. not walking that far for this stupid plan. So make up a number. And so he comes back and he tells David, and as soon as he gives David the number, David's like, I shouldn't have done that. Job's like, you think? I've been telling you that for the last however long.
Yeah, who knows how long.
But yeah, this is really an element with David with Bathsheba. He's despising God's promises. And you're right, that goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. And I place more of the blame on Adam, just kind of a theological aside, completely hypothetical. But I am personally of the opinion that had Eve sinned and not Adam, I don't know that there would have been a fall per se, if that makes sense. Because Adam was the representative and Eve was the helper. Now that's, again, purely hypothetical. I'm reading so much into the text there. The fact that Adam is standing there with her is extremely significant. This is not Eve doing something and Adam being like, well, I didn't do it. No, you were there the whole time as the head, as the representative. You are fully responsible for everything that happened. And yet the text says they saw that it was good for food. And yet you're basically saying all this other good is not good enough. And Adam's like, yeah, just take it. Why not? I mean, I can kind of picture him standing with a big dumb look on his face. Oh, I guess. Well, just eat it. Yes.
Like, why was that so appealing to you?
Yep. But again, it comes down to we're basically despising everything else that God has given us.
Mm-hmm.
It's not good enough. I want the one thing that God says I can't have.
It's almost like going after a steak dinner when like every other tree also has its own steak dinner.
Yes.
Kind of weird. But
Yep. Yeah, because I mean, basically Satan convinces them, God has told you that you can't eat of this tree because God is a big meanie and he's holding back. He knows you'll be like him, and he doesn't want that.
So I think you're going in this like perfect garden that has beauties that like we've never seen.
Oh yeah.
And it has to be just like, that one.
Yep. Because God is the big divine killjoy who's ruining all your fun. And imagine how wonderful it could be if you could have that too. Instead of look at everything that God has.
When the serpent says to Eve, you know, God doesn't want you to eat this because then he knows you're going to be like him. He knows that you will attain this knowledge. He says that to Eve. But how much influence did that have over Adam?
I think a lot.
Because I think that's why Adam's still very wrong with it.
Uh-huh.
Because I don't think that's as much of a sway for a woman. Oh, you'll be knowledge and you'll be like God. But I can see Adam sitting there like, oh yeah, let's eat this one.
Mm-hmm.
And he hasn't paid careful enough attention to the words of God. He doesn't catch the distortion.
Mm-hmm.
What that Eve reports.
Oh yeah.
Because like, Eve wasn't there when God gave that command.
No.
To Adam.
That's right.
But Adam was.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so basically Satan has just insinuated, as Adam is standing there, hey Eve, is Adam a liar? And you would expect Adam to be like, I'm right here. But no, he just stands there. In fact, you don't even know that Adam is there until after she takes the fruit. And she gives it to Adam, who was with her. And then you're like, wait, he was there? Like you just assume there is no way ever that Adam would actually be there because of all the stuff that is insulting to him as this is going on. And just how clear of a violation this is. And then when you find out that Adam has been there, it's, I think, very appropriate that Moses does not mention Adam until you get to the end. He was there, but really he didn't do anything, so I'm not going to mention it. Oh, by the way, he was there. And you're like, is that what? But yeah, it's despising God. In fact, sometimes we talk about how, I'm trying to think how the phrase goes, forbidden fruit is sweeter, or something along those lines. I can't think of the exact phrase, but it's kind of along that well, I've even heard it in our culture, people say it. I'm not really sure where it comes from. Just the idea of that forbidden fruit is even sweeter than the normal fruit. But that's a completely anti-biblical idea because no, actually, you know, everything that God has given you is better. Isaiah says, don't go after empty cisterns that hold no water. Actually, it might be Jeremiah that says that, but don't go after these empty cisterns of you think it's better, but it's not. It's actually, there's a way that seems right to a man, but its way is death. This is killing you. In some ways, if we could be more graphic, it's not even so much reaching out for the stake when every other tree has stake. It's reaching out for the piece of dog poop that's hanging on the tree that is shaped like a stake when there's stake on every other tree. And you think that you're reaching out for this thing that is good, and you can't, you're not even, it just stinks, and it clearly looks like dog poop, but you've convinced yourself that's a filet mignon, and it's better than any other cut of steak on any other tree. And, God is just sitting there looking, and Satan is like, you're an idiot, I like it. You're easy to trick. I just got to convince you that it looks like a steak. But, that's basically what David has done and continues to do throughout his career of this looks good, and so I'm going to go and take it.
I'm really interested in trying to learn about doctrine from the narrative books.
Mm-hmm.
This. I think Second Samuel is really important to trying to understand the doctrine of sin. And it's
Yes.
Like we think about sin as like, okay, you do this thing and you repent and you kind of move on.
Mm-hmm.
We think that David sinned, he repents, and you just move on because he repented, everything's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe his child has to die, and then you go on. But everything else that happens after that is a direct result of that sin. So
Yes.
It's almost like everything that happens to him afterwards, after chapter 11, could have been written by Dante.
Yes.
It's just like a perfectly appropriate judgment for everything that he's done. And
Yes.
there's so much in this one act that you can pick out. Like all these people that he is sending would have had to have known what, or could have put together what had happened. So he's spreading this around. He tells it to Joab. Joab knows that he's given this wicked man a great deal of power over him, and putting himself in the future, like his future decisions under the influence of this wicked man. And there's someone I read about just pointed out that Bathsheba was most likely the granddaughter of the who betrays David.
Yep.
And tells Absalom to seek the concubines in the roof of the palace, the very place where he laid eyes on Bathsheba. He had to think, like, if that relationship is true, then Ahithophel is thinking of that.
Yeah.
And getting back at him.
Mm-hmm. I forget how they got there, but I believe she is.
Yeah, she's called the daughter of a lion. He's also one of the mighty men. And in that list, he's called the son of Ahithophel.
Yes.
So if they're the same ones.
Right. I don't know how popular Ahithophel was as a name. I would name it Ahithophel, but I'm not Jewish, so. Yeah, it makes sense that it would be the same one. But it is a fascinating twist of you're just connecting the dots.
And you can see how the sin, like maybe David's insecurity of the sin, leads to how he handles Amnon and Uriah and all that. And like just this one sin, it's not just that acting is over with. Everything that it affects the next generation too, and almost completely destroys the kingdom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, even it's great that Solomon becomes king, but he wasn't supposed to be in the family. There wasn't supposed to be a Bathsheba. There wasn't supposed to be a Solomon. There wasn't supposed to be, so the chain reaction even there, that on the one hand looks good, but yet on the other hand, when you realize where the line of David eventually ends up, it does raise questions as to, it's purely hypothetical, but what if David had not had the affair with Bathsheba? It's somewhat implied, would Uriah have died some other way? Because God says, look, I gave you everything, and I would have given you much more. Which, again, purely hypothetical. But it almost sounds as though God is saying, I would have worked everything out. Similar to him telling Israel, you can have a king in Deuteronomy 17, but then getting mad when they asked for a king because they rejected him. if you just waited around, we could have skipped this whole Saul thing. We could have gone straight to David. Again, purely hypothetical because there isn't like alternate timelines. We're not in the Marvel universe where it's these different offshoots. God has one timeline. But it is fascinating when you consider how much David screwed up. I mean, it's even what we're talking about in 1 Samuel 12 on Sunday, of Samuel warns Israel about sin, and he tells them, God will never forsake you. But if you sin, he will, sweep you away with your king, which he does eventually. He does sweep them all away to Babylon. So he warns them, but he's promising them, look, God's never going to forsake you. But life is going to be pretty bad if you don't obey him. It's going to be terrible. He's going to punish you and your king. Not going to forsake you. He's made you his people, but you may all end up dying in another country. So you're right, there are consequences, and especially in David's family, it's horrific. So here God has made this unconditional covenant with David in chapter 7, and yet it is conditional in the sense that God promises even in chapter 7, if your son disobeys, implication, if you disobey David, I'm going to punish you. And that's exactly what happens. He disobeys. And he's punished, but then there's also those consequences that come out. Yeah, it's horrific.
His succession is it a God or a reward for his ministry? I've always wondered that. I don't think this is too much to bring this to the other side of, but like her line is now
Right.
So it always makes me wonder when people try to paint her as this, nasty heifer. It's like, well, yeah, but her son is now David.
Right.
More so reminds me of Ruth.
Yeah.
Moabite needed Ruth because of her faithfulness.
Yeah.
Or is it just God's graciousness to David and Bathsheba's to Uriah?
Yeah, I almost lean more towards the first one. I can't prove it textually.
Yeah.
But when I read it, she just seems very, sweet. Even the fact that Adonijah, the first son, who was the oldest, at least in the line, goes to her and says, hey, go ask Solomon if I can have, is it Abishag? Or Abishag? If I can have David's concubine. And I don't know if Bathsheba is thinking, this is going to get rid of Adonijah because Solomon's going to go ballistic when I ask this, or if she's just very innocent of, I'm going to go ask. I'm doing the queen mother thing. I'm going to go present this request to Solomon and see what he wants with it. She's not manipulative. She's not. Some people have tried to make the argument that David is so senile by the time you get to 1 Kings that he doesn't know up from down or left from right. And so Nathan and Bathsheba manipulate him and convince him that he had promised that Solomon would be king. The part that I would say is a mark against that is the fact that Solomon is called Jedediah, beloved of the Lord. That's a pretty significant title. Nobody else in David's line is called Jedediah. In fact, I don't know anybody else in all Scripture named Jedediah. That's and God Himself names Solomon and says, call him Jedediah. There are a couple people in the Old Testament that are named by God. They're pretty few and far between. Abraham receives a new name. Sarah receives a new name. But here's an infant. And Steve's way should lead to baptism. There's an infant. Here's an infant, and God is you're converted right here. And God says to him, name that child Jedediah. That is my beloved. That's the beloved of the Lord. That's
That's very significant, and I would say that is more why Solomon ends up as king, is that God told David, Solomon is your successor. He never names him. He always refers to him as your son, even in chapter 7. In fact, in chapter 7, as he's making this covenant with David, he's talking about your son will build the temple. The son's not born yet. At least chronologically, the way that the writer of 2 Samuel has set the book up. Presumably, it would make sense that he has not set it up yet. Because David appears to be in Jerusalem when he sees Bathsheba. And it sounds like him deciding to build a house for God is fairly early on in his time in Jerusalem. I'm inferring there. So I would say that Solomon, because Solomon's not born in Hebron, he's born in Jerusalem. The text is explicit on that. That all takes place after this covenant. So God makes a covenant with him about what his son is going to do, but the son isn't even born yet. David doesn't know who the son is, although maybe at that point he's assuming that the son is Amnon, because that's his oldest. Amnon is going to build the temple of God. Nope, Amnon's going to get murdered. Absalom's going to be killed in battle. Adonijah's an idiot, and so we're going to be left with Solomon, who's still not even really fourth in line, because we've had numerous wives and children that have been born, and Solomon is somewhere down the line, and yet God is saying, okay, now this son is the fulfillment of that covenant promise. Call him Jedediah. He's the one who's going to build my temple. And the fact that God said to David in that covenant, I will be a father to him and he will be my son. To then call him Jedediah sounds like something that you would say to a child, my beloved. One of the only other places that I can think of where that language is used is in Song of Solomon. I am my beloved and my beloved is mine. That's the same. It's the noun form of this kind of weird participle thing that is Jedediah, beloved of the Lord. So, that's very intimate, familial language, which sounds like this is my son. Your son's now my son. I'm going to be a father to him. Name him Jedediah. He's the next king. So I don't take it as Nathan and Bathsheba manipulating anything. I take it as, no, David really did say that. And again, the writer of Samuel has not really felt the need to sugarcoat anything. So I don't know that he would say, he tells us that Nathan says, hey, look, Bathsheba, here's how we're going to play this. I'll go in first, and you come in, and, so he's willing to say that. So why not just come out and say, and David had no clue what was going on and just went along with it. It's not like you're preserving. The guy's an old man in bed with a concubine who is so old that he can't actually do anything with this really hot concubine. It's a pretty pathetic scene by the end of David's life. So it's not like he's preserving any sort of splendor in David by not emphasizing the fact that David's clueless. David can't even stay warm. He's so weak, and he is old, even by our standards. A 70-year-old that's old for Jewish men. He's up there in age, and it's not really surprising that he can't stay warm. So it's a pretty pathetic picture by the end. And yet, that's the succession, which we'll look at in more detail next week because it fits in with Solomon and the temple. But I think it's certainly something that David had set up prior to his death, that Solomon would be the next king. And then Adonijah kind of takes it upon himself
Which, I mean, you can't blame Adonijah. He's the oldest man, oldest son left. So why not? Why not be the king? The fact that the way that Adonijah responds when he finds out that Solomon has been named king suggests to me that Adonijah knew that he was not king, that he knew Solomon was king. Because if you're the oldest and you're the next in line to the throne, and your younger brother sets himself up as king, good for him. You would think that I'm the rightful king, he's the upstart. But instead, as soon as everybody hears that, they all run home, which makes no sense whatsoever in terms of ancient Near Eastern, maybe you go and you raise an army, this is my right, I'm the king. And the fact that Adonijah comes back and basically says, oh, sorry, my bad. And Joab gets executed for it. Abiathar ends up being stripped from the priesthood because of it. All of it suggests to me they knew full well Solomon was supposed to be king. And that it's not just Nathan and Bathsheba that knew that. Everybody knew Solomon is supposed to be king. So long answer to your question. But yes, I think Solomon God has orchestrated events, even in the midst of David's sin, to bring about Solomon as the king. And Bathsheba plays a significant part in that, especially in those first few chapters of Kings, as they're having this line of succession, passing on the kingship to Solomon, he's crowned king. His dad's not even dead yet.
Another thing that's not usually done.
No, it's not at all. But I think David realizes I'm going to be dead soon, and Solomon needs to be established as king. And at least if I'm alive, there's no political intrigue over who's the king. You just come ask me, I'll tell you who the king is. Because even in Kings then, David gives Solomon instructions on here's how to be king. Here's what you need to do as king. So that either took place chronologically before the whole scenario, which proves the fact that David had already talked to Solomon about it, or it takes place after that scenario where he says, no, it's Solomon. And then he says, okay, bring him in, I'll give him some instructions. Again, emphasizing the fact that he is the next king. He's been appointed by God as the next king, and he's going to build the house of God. So it's a fascinating book. And I've enjoyed looking at it in greater detail than I typically do when I read through 2 Samuel, because it seems like a bunch of stories. But one of the things you mentioned, the idea of how do you exegete narrative, it's been fascinating to consider what stories are included, what stories are not included, and then why. Why is that story included and why is that story not included? What is the purpose of this? It's not just telling us events for the sake of events. There are books that do that, and you could do that. They don't do that. So it's very much has a theological agenda, and so then part of the exegesis is figuring out, okay, what message is being communicated here with this particular event? I think sometimes when we read the Old Testament historical books, we read them the same way we read the book of Acts. It's history. This is what happened. And as you read the book of Acts, you kind of think, okay, you got on a ship and you traveled across the water and you ended up in another place. Great. I don't know what that has to do with anything, but okay. And then you realize, well, Luke is a Greek. He thinks like a Greek. We think very much like Greeks. It's history. This is how we got from point A to point B. You can't just show up at point B. You got to get there. So we took a boat. That's how we got there. Then you're like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And then you read 2 Samuel, and you're like, wait, well, how did you get there? Where's the boat ride? Why is the boat ride not mentioned? How did you get there? What are you doing there? Why are you telling me this? Why, all of a sudden it's like, no, this doesn't fit. And so if we try to read 2 Samuel from the perspective of Dr. Luke, it doesn't work. So we have to really put ourselves in that mindset of, okay, we're talking 3,000 years ago. We're talking history, and to some degree, if you've read any other ancient histories, they're not really that much different from 2 Samuel, with the one caveat being ancient histories are designed to make the king look good. This one's not, which I think in some ways is the major flag that sticks out of, oh, wait a minute, this is not, we're not reading an account of how Darius became king. Because when you read the historical accounts of how Darius became king, you get really confused really fast. Because there's another guy whose name starts with a G, I can't remember his name, but basically he pretended to be king, but he wasn't king. In fact, he wasn't even who he was pretending to be. He was just some random guy, possibly a servant, who set himself up as a guy who set himself up as king. You know, he was a dude playing a dude dressed as another dude. I mean, it was kind of
Nice historical summary there.
yes, yeah, right from Tropic Thunder. So thank you, Robert Downey Jr. So it becomes pretty convoluted, but in the end, you're left with, wow, Darius is awesome. When you read this, it kind of reads the same, except that it's the exact opposite point. David's not awesome. And so even that kind of jumps out at you and causes you to think, okay, so what is your point? Why are you telling me this? Because I'm not even reading the way that I read Kings. That reads more like true history than Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Even Joshua read more like a linear history. We killed this guy, and then we went over here, we killed this guy, and then we killed this guy, and then that was it. And you're like, okay, that makes sense. Here, you're reading, and you're, whoa, this is, you know, I'm the only kind of modern equivalent that I can think of is if we sat down and decided to write an account of the 8 years of Bill Clinton as president. So I'm going to tell you about the presidency of Bill Clinton. And so out of a book that has 45 chapters telling you about the presidency of Bill Clinton, all that is in there is about, I don't know, a chapter and a half about all the good that he did for the economy. And then the rest of the book is all about the Whitewater scandal and Monica Lewinsky and his crazy relationship with Hillary. And as you're reading it, you're thinking, I feel like I'm reading Pulp Fiction. I don't really feel like I'm reading a historical account of the presidency of Bill Clinton. I really feel like I'm reading a biography of somebody who hated the guy and wants to smear him as much as possible. Not really a history. And to some degree, even with reading this account of David, 40 years, and yet you spend more time talking about his 3 or 4 major failures and the dysfunction of his house. You know, let me tell you about the 8 years of Bill Clinton as president. Do you know what Chelsea was doing? You know, I remember when George Bush was president, and that was the big thing. What crazy trouble were his daughters getting themselves into at the University of Texas or wherever they were. And part of me was like, who cares? He's president of the United States. We talk about what he's doing there rather than what his daughters are doing. But, you know, it kind of reads the same way. I'm going to tell you about David's 40 years as king. So his one son raped his sister, and then his other son had a revolt, and you're kind of left with this feeling, I don't feel like I had any idea what happened in those 40 years, but I know all the bad things that happened. I know all the scandals. I know what was in the tabloids. I know what National Enquirer was saying about David back in the day. I had no clue what he did. And so then you have to stop and ask, okay, why? Why are you telling me this? And I think it's similar to what we've said tonight of he's either trying to teach future generations of kings, or he's just trying to teach the average Israelite of, look, you gotta rely on God. And yeah. David knew that at times, but
I guess it's really to ensure that God is held up as the greatest king.
Yeah.
And that, there's no, after you read 2 Samuel, you're not going to make an idol out of David.
No.
And so maybe that's part of the purpose, to ensure that he's not idolized.
Yeah.
But that God's faithfulness to him and God's promise to him over them.
Yeah.
How do you teach your sins?
Yeah.
Holy cow. Teach picture setting all the Grecian off.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't even look at your house because this is
Yep.
what happened in your house. Is like, just get some to stay home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I started preaching, because I cheated, I taught historical books this semester, preached through 1st and 2nd Samuel, and am doing my dissertation on it, so that I can do one set of research. Yes, very convenient. I planned it this way.
Yeah, prayer meeting.
And prayer meeting, yeah. And that was not intentional. That just kind of happened that we ended up in prayer meeting. We've been going through the prayers of the Old Testament word for Samuel. So it all kind of fit together. But it's funny, as I started preaching through 1st Samuel, there are clues in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and 2 that when Saul gets here, he's going to be an idiot. There's just hints. There's a lot of references to the word sha'al, which means to ask. And it just seems very much like the writer knows Saul's coming and it's not going to be good. And so there's all this emphasis that seems to be suggesting, Samuel. Samuel's the replacement for Eli. David's the replacement for Saul. And there are a lot of scholars who take it that way. But the more I get deeper and deeper into 1 Samuel, I realize the writer of 1 Samuel is not setting up Samuel as the replacement for Eli. He's the temporary replacement for Eli. But he's actually not the priest. He's a prophet. Acts like a priest, but he's a prophet. There's actually still the line of Saul, or this line of Eli that continues until David dies. And yeah, it's kind of hinting at David, but realizing it's not David either. And how much of that is the writer of Samuel, as he starts the story, deliberately setting it up to make you think that Samuel and David are going to be the fulfillments, as though he himself is thinking that. Eli's an idiot, but hey, we got Samuel, the faithful priest, who's not a priest, prophet, but you're going to raise up a faithful priest. And then David, the man after God's own heart. And yet, even looking at the two of them and realizing he's looking for somebody else. Because the book definitely ends with this question mark of, well, it's great. We've got chapter 2, which is the Song of Hannah. We got chapter 22 at the end of 2 Samuel, which is the other bookend, this other great summary song. And yet you finish and you're like, I don't feel any better. I actually feel worse because I thought David was going to be the answer. I thought this was the end of Judges. And all you've done is promoted the judges and made them kings, but they're just as incompetent. So what have we really accomplished? And then you go into Kings and it's all downhill. And yet, as much as David understands that he's looking ahead for somebody else, I think the writer of Samuel knows there's somebody else. I think he knows, even as he's writing 2 Samuel 7, and your son from your line will sit on the throne forever. I think he knows. And I think he wants to make it clear it's not David. And it's not Solomon. It's not any of them. It's not Eli. It's not Samuel. There is somebody else coming. And he's not here yet. But he's going to come from David's line. And he's going to be the faithful priest that's going to be raised up by God. Not Eli. And not even Zadok, who is the line that replaces the line of Eli. It's not going to be him either. There's a faithful priest coming. And there's a faithful king coming. And there's a greater prophet like Samuel and like Moses that's coming. But it's none of them. And you're just going to have to wait. So the book almost deliberately ends on a question mark, as though then we're going into 1 Kings like, well, now we're going to find out who it is. And then, every time, nope, not him, nope, not him, nope, not him, nope. And so you're just kind of left with this lingering question mark throughout the rest of Israel's history. Well, where is he? Who is he?
Then all that's happened so far, too.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Which would explain then why Bathsheba ends up in Jesus' genealogy. Not just because she's one of the few women in the Old Testament that's named,
Because there's several women that could have been included in the genealogy of Jesus that are not. So each of them is picked for a specific reason. And I wonder how much of it is a nod back to Bathsheba of this is the one. When he said he was going to be somebody from the line of David, it was not even Solomon, but it was Bathsheba's son that would eventually come. And so even there in Samuel, you're left with, we're expecting Christ. We just don't know when. So they're waiting and they're longing and they're hoping. And David in the Psalms is longing and hoping. Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I put all your enemies under your feet as a footstool. And he knows. He won't let your Holy One see decay, and all the things that Peter mentions in Pentecost, chapter 2 of the book of Acts, all those great quotations from the Psalms of David. I think it's pretty clear that the writer of Psalms knew, or of Samuel knew, and wants to make it clear that we know, even if we don't know who it is, we know who it's not. It's not David. Yeah. It's a fascinating book. Yeah. I wish we had more than just 3 weeks to look at it.
I saw like maybe less than one episode of Game of Thrones, so I'm not sure much about it. But I want someone to do like that kind of a style production.
Oh, yeah.
Like, statistics, everything.
Right.
I know.
Nope.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's
You're doing it all.
trophy.
So much of it just seems like it was made for cinema. So like a great novelization.
Oh, yeah.
Go out and do it myself someday. But
Yeah.
so like it should exist.
Yeah, I have thought several times of contacting HBO
Yeah.
and just saying, look, there is a segment of the population that will not watch Game of Thrones and will not watch any of the other smut that you put on your channel. They're not going to watch it. So there are a number of people that are never going to pay, and I mean, you get HBO now for $15 a month. They're never going to pay because they don't want to watch your garbage. And it's a pretty large chunk of our culture that falls into that category. Should be larger, but there's a pretty large chunk of our culture that falls into that. If you want to get them as customers, here's the perfect way. You produce a clean, but still very intriguing and very biblical approach to Joshua, Judges, and Samuel. You will get them by the thousands. They will all gladly pay $15 a month in order to watch kind of our generation's equivalent of the Ten Commandments. I mean, this will be the thing. It could be far bigger than Game of Thrones.
There's enough smut in the Bible.
There is.
Besides my husband.
There is, absolutely.
They have to try it out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And they tend to, I mean, I watched there's an edited version, an edited pirated version from Canada.
Guys.
It is. It's funny. So I actually was contacted by HBO because the guy who produces it only edits the ones that need editing. And as the series went on, they didn't all need editing because once they had hooked everybody, they stopped putting all the garbage in them. So I had to go find other pirated versions in order to fill in gaps for the ones that were not that he had edited. And but we were like probably three and a half seasons in before that happened, and almost immediately I received a notice from HBO that my IP address had downloaded pirated materials and that I needed to cease and desist. Yeah, that's crazy. And I was fascinated because I'm like, they have to know that this guy's doing this. I mean, there were so many viewers downloading the edited version, and I think they gave it a pass because he had edited it and they knew why he was doing it. And the rest of it, they just left. So I went and got the $15 a month version of HBO, and I would watch the edited ones, and then he would put on his website where it would have been, episode 5, season 3, he would just put a note,
no editing necessary, this episode's clean. And then I could go to the HBO website and download the correct one that I need in order to fill in the gaps. So that's kind of how I justified it in my mind anyway. And HBO seemed cool with that. If I gave them $15, and so it wasn't like they were losing money on me, they got the same amount of money they would have got. But once, as the season went on, as the series went on, they no longer needed as much stuff in there because they hooked everybody. And so I'm thinking, okay, you've got a group of people, if you do this well, you don't need any of that garbage in there. You're going to hook them from day one because they want to see this well-produced Bible series. And so I've considered several times contacting HBO and just saying, you should make this.
Part of me wants to like go and spend years and like get scholar like period of the books. But if they ever do that, I can like get
Yes.
a consultant for it. You
Yeah.
do it. You get it.
Yeah.
I think that'd just be a fun job that you might.
Oh yeah. And there's lots of fascinating stuff out there on both in archaeology and stuff they're still finding about David's kingdom and yeah. I mean, I love. It's not my. It's hard to say what is my favorite part of the Old Testament. I think I really like poetry, but I do enjoy research on this part. Even which probably came through even in my dorky map that I made in the lecture, putting all the dots in the map. But just I like that kind of stuff of being able in my head to visualize. Okay, so they're moving here. No.
It's helpful if you try to get a feel for where things are.
Yeah.
Like, I never thought about like why the Philistines are just goes
Mm-hmm.
and you pointing up and down.
Yeah. Yep. Well, even when you get to the prophets and he talks about the enemy from the north, I'm like, they're not coming from the north. Actually, they are coming from the north. Because there's this giant desert that they can't get across. So they have to go all the way up the Fertile Crescent and then back down. And so when they invade Israel, they come from the north. I wonder, I would think Babylon was a big enough kingdom, as was Assyria. I would think they were smart enough to know they're not really northerners. There were kingdoms to the north, but none of them really messed with the Israelites. The Hittites and the Horites were to the north. Not the Horites, Hittites. Hittites and Hivites were to the north. Horites were the ones in the southeast that the Edomites had destroyed. But they still always refer to it as the north. So the geography always fascinates me. I like that part of it. So, yeah. Yeah, I hope someday they do it. I don't know if they will. Probably not.
Like so many of these film adaptations of Bible stories do just like the stupidest things before and do just like unbiblical stuff to make it interesting. But like you wouldn't have to do any of that.
I know.
It's all there.
Yeah, I mean
Have
some
to
of
come
it.
up with a good guy to be
Yeah.
a hero.
Yeah, well, I mean, the books Game of Thrones are not done yet, so they kind of sped up with the series of films, but they kind of made Jon Snow out to be the hero of the movies, sort of. And I don't know that that's what he's going to do in the books because he doesn't have heroes in his books.
Right.
He's pretty good at destroying everybody's life, and I think so. Well, that's what I'm thinking. There's no clear hero. You just got one dysfunction after another. Yeah, and I mean, you could keep the intrigue going for decades. If you keep making the show. Yeah, just going on and on and on and on and on. It's, yeah. So I read all your papers and gave you all your feedback. So they were very good. I'm very interested and intrigued about how that's all going to go. The next part of the paper is due the 25th of March. Is that right? That's the
It says next week, or at least it's on campus. It said class 7.
Oh. Yes, you're right. Next week is the next part. The rough draft is due the 25th.
Okay.
So next week is the 11th, and then you have 2 weeks for your rough draft.
Next week is when that 2 additional pages.
Yes, yeah, and you don't necessarily have to build off of the first part that you filled in. It's just more that I kind of know the direction that you're going. So this is the part where you're explaining, okay, these are the particular verses and passages, and almost like a rough outline, but kind of you're doing a theme. Here are the significant passages and why I picked them. Here's how they build my thesis. So you're kind of laying out your argument almost in an outline, but kind of, I mean, so, passage A, passage B, passage C, therefore my thesis is proved.
And so the final paper will basically just be like an expansion of what we do in this next book, or we have like add a different like conceptual part?
It will be basically fleshing out what you put in for next week. Yep. So next week will kind of be like, okay, here's a snippet of why this is important. So then when you actually write the paper, you'll explain this is why it's important. So you don't have to give me lots of detail of why it's important, but so if you were to, I think the example I used in the syllabus has to do with temple, I think. So, okay, I'm going to talk about the Garden of Eden, and then I'm going to talk about tabernacle, and then I'm going to talk about temple, and the tabernacle is important because you see all this imagery of the Garden of Eden in the tabernacle, and the temple is important because you see all the imagery of the tabernacle and the Garden of Eden in the temple. Okay, great. But then in the paper, you need to actually tell me what that imagery is of the pomegranates and the vines and the cherubim and the seraphim and the stars on the ceiling. And you need to actually unpack, okay, when I said all the imagery, here's the imagery that I meant. So you're kind of unpacking what you're telling me in just kind of snippet form. Because next week, I basically want to know you hit all the significant parts in your argument that you're making, and don't have any passages that, you probably just skip that one, or, oh, well, you left this passage out, you should look at this one. So I want to know which passages you're planning on using, but I don't just want a list of, here's 6 passages. I want you to explain to me why you picked those 6, just so I know we're on the same page of, I agree that was important, but why do you think it's important? Just so that I know that you know that we're headed in the same direction, so that when we get to your rough draft, it's not, whoa, I didn't know he was going there. Oh, time out, we gotta start over. I don't want that to happen. So, yeah.
This says the rough draft is due on April 8th. On that page.
Really?
This might have been.
Huh.
This was a syllabus of January 12th.
That is a good question. I don't know. That is a very good question.
When does the class actually end? Is it like beginning of?
Yes.
That's what I was.
Yes. May 6th is what this is. File exam due and wrap up dinner discussion.
That's what I was thinking.
Huh.
Is there already a restaurant, Charles?
I don't know. Last time, a couple times ago, we ended up at Sarah's house.
Not bad.
Yeah, that. Yeah, what I was looking at. I think you're right. I think the rough draft is April 8th, because then that gives you spring break, or any spring break to work on it. I think the exam is due the 25th.
Oh,
The take-home exam.
right. I forgot about
Yeah.
that. Yeah, and that's
So- Yes, I think that's what it is. Yeah, I think I have my dates backwards. So on the 18th, I will give you the exam, and then you will take that home and email it to me or submit it, upload it online by the 25th. Because I want it over and done with before you guys go on spring break, so that you can then focus on your rough draft. So that'll give you 4 weeks-ish from next Thursday to do the rough draft. So yeah, so next week is passages that are important for developing the theme, how they're going to develop them, and then the rough draft is actually developing them. And there is in the syllabus, there is a rubric I don't remember off the top of my head, but there's some information in there as well on chasing the theme down and how to do that. Because there's a rubric for theme papers. There's also a rubric for exegetical papers, depending on what you picked. Yeah, but yeah, I think you guys all have really good topics, and yeah, I like your thesis statements. So it'll be good. Excited to read them. So, yeah. Well, that's all I have. Next week we will sort of wrap up 2 Samuel-ish, barely, and most of the time will be spent on 1 Kings. So Kings is more bland history. So we won't spend as much time in Kings or Chronicles. We kind of pick up the pace in terms of how many chapters we'll cover. So we'll cover all of 1 Kings next week, all of 2 Kings the week after that, all of Chronicles the week after that, Ezra, Nehemiah, Ruth, Esther. So the test will cover up through Kings. Yeah. So if you have any questions, I did upload the questions for the exam on Canvas. So they are under on the top part where it says pre-class info, it says syllabus, and then right underneath that it should say exam 1, midterm questions. And not all of the questions will be on the exam. That's a pool to choose from. And I haven't decided how many I'll pick. As if I'm in a good mood or not.
Depends on how much you must have read.
That too. I had a professor, he would always talk about how he was the professor version of Darth Vader. And as freshmen, he would talk about how horrible he was, and that everybody referred to him as the Darth Vader of professors because he was really mean and dark on his exams. And after the first exam, I realized that if he wore a Darth Vader tie the day of the exam, we were all going to get A's. And then he had to compensate for how easy the test was by giving us this big sob story of how hard of a professor he was. He was so easy. So, yeah. Dr. Masood. He was the professor that actually never read our papers. Ever.
Never read them?
Nope, never read them.
Wow.